So in my last video on suicide terrorism, I talked about the study of Professor Robert A. Pape, who's put together the comprehensive list of suicide terror attacks really since the 1970s, 1980s, and cataloged them and looked at their causes. And his conclusion, and those working with him, he documents in his paper, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and also in a book in which he writes about the same topic called Dying to Win, The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism. And he determines that the greatest indicator of suicide terrorism, the greatest predictor of whether people from a group will be suicide terrorists, is that of foreign occupation, which I want to define a little bit more carefully today. Talk about the war on terror in general, but also talk about how this contributes to the Afghanistan war overall. Pape writes, suicide terrorism is an extreme strategy for national liberation. Although isolated incidents do occur, the overwhelming majority of suicide terrorist attacks take place as part of coherent campaigns in which individual after individual or team after team voluntarily kill themselves as a means to kill the maximum number of people in the target society in order to compel that state to end a foreign occupation in their homeland. So there are a few outliers in suicide terrorism, but as Pape's database and quantitative research in this area describes and demonstrates, that suicide terrorism is an extreme strategy that is aimed at usually national liberation. It's used to provoke action on behalf of Western liberal democracies for the most part. And so while there's a few outliers of what we might think of as more random suicide terror events, it's usually a strategic plan, as he says, to target civilians within a certain society, within a state, that to end foreign occupation of their homeland. And so this, with regard to Muslim terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and the Afghanistan war and Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, this has to do with their understanding of the Arabian Peninsula, not necessarily just the individual, what we might think of as nation states within it, but the whole Arabian Peninsula as this Arabian Holy Land that is under military occupation from the West, especially the United States, for multiple decades. And so this is why you see in this set of the last 20 years, you see an increase in suicide terrorism from Islamic countries or countries that have relatives from them that are Islamic and have a shared identity through their Muslim religion, through being sometimes being Arabic, but not necessarily, but that idea of compelling the United States to end its occupation of what they see as the Muslim Holy Land. He writes, absent a foreign military presence that threatens core elements in a community's national identity, such a transformation of communal norms to commit suicide terrorism is likely to be rare. In other words, in even which I could talk about in another video, suicide is actually frowned on in the Islamic faith for the most part. Suicide is looked on as morally wrong, and it has a stigma around it. In most Muslim circles, in the majority of the Muslim faith, view it this way. So what provokes them towards suicide terrorism? Now, their religion does have a philosophy or a theology of martyrdom, and that is true. But Pape writes that without a foreign military presence, you don't really have this transformation of communal norms to go from being someone who's you traditionally against suicide to being someone who is for suicide or thinks suicide is morally allowable. He says that suicide's likely to be rare. And so the conclusion from this is that if there is no foreign military presence, there's little risk of suicide terrorism from a population. How is occupation defined? Because most Americans wouldn't put it in terms of we're occupying the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. But occupation is simply just the exertion of political control over a territory by an outside group. And the United States government and military has had a troop presence in the Middle East for decades. And so, this definition of occupation, exertion of political control over a territory by an outside group, fits with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and may also apply to Oman, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. And you also have to consider this, that especially bin Ladenites, which during this time there were few early on in the war on terror, but Muslims in general, or people living in these countries in the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, don't necessarily see it as we would think of a region like Europe that has all these states that are close together, like France has its own government, Switzerland has its own government, a nation state, and all the Germany and so on, where all these are independent nation states and sovereign governments. They do have separate governments. They do have borders that we could draw on a map around these what we call states, but they don't see it in that modern nation state idea. It's more of a shared identity of that whole peninsula, especially the core being Saudi Arabia. And so occupation of Saudi Arabia is seen by those living in the surrounding states in that region as occupation of their homeland, of their peninsula, of their holy land. And so this creates a great resentment against the United States and its government and provokes suicide terrorism. And so this is what has been experienced. Is, number one, U.S. combat troops have been present on their soil, the states above mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, in nations adjacent to them for more than a decade. So that's seen as foreign occupation. Also, oil interests may cause the U.S. troops might be used to, let me reword that, to prop up pro-Western regimes. So may cause the U.S. To use troops to prop up these regimes. And so these often the United States supports these certain dictatorships that are not appreciated by the people under those dictatorships, but they're kept in power and supported by the United States, for example, Saudi Arabia, and others that are supported. And that also creates a sense of resentment and a threat to national identity in these areas. Pape writes, in short, the presence of heavy American military power, tens of thousands of frontline combat troops since 1990 on the Arabian Peninsula constitutes a foreign occupation, certainly in the eyes of opponents of local regimes. This is so even if the United States disputes the characterization. So most Americans wouldn't think of it like this because we live an ocean away in the West in relative safety, besides when we are hit by suicide terrorism. We sit away from this and we wouldn't think of the United States government as occupying the Middle East, but that's how it's being seen. As since 1990, the Arabian Peninsula has seen itself as being occupied. And so interventions in this region, really since the 1970s, plus tens of thousands of combat troops in the Arabian Peninsula since 1990 constitutes foreign occupation. So whether or not we like that term or the insinuation of what that means for the United States, it is a reality for the people living under it uh, in these regimes. They do experience this all the time. And so this is what leads to the greatest predictor of suicide terrorism is this foreign occupation of the Arabian